Maybe you've seen this meme featuring a Chinese.
Fantastic, beautiful Americans.
Amazing, right? Yes, this is what you're wishing for.
I also found it very striking. But aside from the fact that these are obviously distressing working conditions, it's also quite nice, hypocritical with each other. Beautiful, sure, we wish everyone the world, but in the meantime, we buy a product for 50 cents from China, which are simply made in sweatshops, also in oppressed regions. But this is indeed a beautiful example of, yes, enjoy that production. Yes, that was it again. We've talked about it before, acting tough at 50%, and now it's all going back to 10%. That's something, again, exemplary.
I found it an absurd week to jump in on that. Of course, and especially towards China, 104% on China. China came back with 84% on the US in terms of tariff. Then China said, the CCP's minister said, it is arrogant and bullying by America, and we are going to file complaints with the World Trade Organization. Well, that's exactly what China did. And then the US Treasury Secretary Barron says that maybe Chinese stocks should be delisted from the American Stock Exchange. Then China says, well, let's reduce our US dollar reserves. And they sell 50 billion in US Treasury bonds. That alone, of course, causes those interest rates, which Trump wants to lower, not to do what he expected them to do. Well, I think that's a short-term effect. Then China goes on to say, well, we've started to respect those IP rights a bit. We shouldn't just copy everything, and we also don't want you to copy everything from us. So let's respect that worldwide. They have said over the past 20 years, well, that is now also in doubt. They say, well, we might not respect all IP rights anymore. That naturally does a lot for American companies because they are really built on that. Well, then the US goes even harder. The tariff goes up to 125% on products from China. And then if you look at what actually America imports from China and China from America, and then I found this quite interesting. Soybeans are the largest product that China imports from the US. They import them to China for 440 million pigs. At the same time, the largest product that America imports from China is smartphones for 232 million Americans. Well, I thought that was quite an interesting comparison. You would have expected that in this chaos, we would all compare pigs with Americans. But still, it's possible.
There was an interesting video by Ray Dalio. I don't know if you know Ray Dalio, a well-known American.
Cripps Waters Associates?
Exactly. Indeed, it embodies the principle that it has a variety of management styles, decentralized thinking, and similar concepts. I find it to be quite a remarkable man to follow. And he also developed an impressive video about the development of the world powers.
But I also have the books.
Definitely read them. And it was, of course, also done in a beautiful graphic design about where the world powers were heading. And that just actually, again, just like last week, space also comes back as a kind of recurring theme. And he illustrated it beautifully that ultimately America is also at the end of its world power and is being challenged. And whether China will be the next one remains to be seen. But they certainly hold all the cards. And of course, the Netherlands was once one of them in the 15th and 16th centuries. And the British followed, then the Americans, and probably now China. But of course, China is naturally a threat to many people, while it is indeed the oldest world power in the world.
Yes, but two things he beautifully outlined, also in the book he wrote, The New World Order. One thing is that he has been to China many times, so he has been able to see firsthand what the culture in China is like. He also lived there for a while. He explained the New World Orders so beautifully. But what I found so beautiful is that he also describes in the book that there would be a trade war between China and the US. Other countries, BRICS countries, would mainly get involved with that. And that there is a kind of division coming, so that there will be multiple New World Orders and not just one. So he also sees that split, which I think I talked about in episode 4. I'm just a student of economics, but I also see those kinds of things reappearing, those patterns.
Yes, history rhymes, history repeats, but that's not it.
But it isn't fun to follow him because of his principles. I often work principle-based in companies where I get to observe, and those I set up myself. It's very valuable to work with systems and principles. He's really a master at it. But you see that it just works out. He was a bit early in predicting when it would happen. He thought it would happen after COVID. You notice now that with Trump the double down is going to come out. Very interesting. And he also says that an energy crisis is coming. You hear that now? You hear us talking about how actually all problems can be traced back to energy supplies.
Always, right? I think we talked about it last week, how ultimately Japan went to war with China over the fact that they were no longer getting oil. If you look back at every war, almost every war can be traced back to energy. Now that energy demand is much greater, perhaps proportionally the same relative to the population of the countries back then. But when energy is scarce, countries start making strange moves. That is certainly a concern for the coming time.
Certainly, but fortunately, we are also seeing more and more development in that technology. The nanomaterials, you already have certain vessels, certain technology that you can simply throw into a vessel. You throw in your lubricating water, whatever you can imagine, throw it in. I have seen some wonderful examples of fully automated water purification installations based on solar panels right in the bush of Africa.
Just seeing what my little water filter that cleans the entire household water can do is quite amazing. Nanoparticles.
That's why we often discount innovation too much. I think we also saw that during the energy crisis in Europe. That naturally started a bit when we had to move away from Russian gas. Perhaps the exact moment was the blowing up of Nord Stream 2. That was really the trigger for us to take action. Perhaps also a wake-up call. The speed with which we then started building terminals for American gas. If we had to do that at a normal pace with regular permit processes, it would have taken us 20 years. And suddenly they were there in a year and a half. That's a kind of innovation. That might even be bureaucratic innovation, but a lot is possible when the pressure is on. And when the pressure isn't on, it's also very difficult.
I think innovation is wonderful, but as long as the legislation doesn't allow it, innovation always gets stuck in execution. As you rightly say, something always needs to happen. That's human behavior anyway. There must first be enough pain before we take action. But that applies to governments too. They all just keep sticking to the rules until it starts to crack and tear, and then they throw it wide open all at once, and then innovation can take its course. We were just talking about how the government is suddenly going to have defense. ESG, ESG, ESG. We need to read ESG a little differently, and now suddenly it is possible. And I think that's beautiful. You'll see the same thing with energy soon. With energy, it will soon be that all those companies will have to stay on their own continent because we don't want to lose them to South America. Then they'll have to do something with the power grid. They'll have to change the legislation so that people can share with each other and still be taxed on it. Because that's really what it's all about. Yes, I always think it has to crack and tear, and then something will come of it.
Legislation is a social consensus that is documented, with a process around it that makes it difficult to change quickly. That's all it is. It is certainly not a law of nature. We have those too, but they are much more fixed than the laws of a country. That's how it works in a democracy. In a dictatorial leadership, a law is not presented as a social collective, and that is the big difference. It also means it can be more decisive. It also means it can be authoritarian and one-sided. Yes, those laws, if they are built on a social foundation, then it indeed means that the majority must experience discomfort for something to change. And then you also need to have a solution that when consensus is carried as the road of least resistance, and if you don't have those elements, then nothing changes and you generally get stuck in that pain. And you see that, for example, in the housing market, you see that in several other areas as well.
What I always find interesting is how much pain there must be for how many people before something is going to change. I always find that tipping point so interesting to keep an eye on. In the housing market, you see, yes, as long as only a few private investors are affected, we won't change much. We'll just push the legislation through. But as soon as the rental market completely stalls, prices only continue to rise. So actually, as soon as you see that a critical mass, but how many people is that, complains loudly enough, then they will look into whether we can reverse or modify it.
And that's why I'm also very interested in Trump's whole approach, because he essentially throws out many of those regulators and rules to let the market dictate much more, whether that's good or not. We've seen in the past that it can also go the wrong way. But you can set frameworks within which people can operate instead of, well, restricting them. Guys, this is the area where we can act, and let's go. Because innovation always outpaces legislation by definition. And we just need to make sure that innovation isn't restricted, because many of the problems we have now, even in energy, the solutions are already there. And that's not a problem. But it can't happen because it's not allowed, because there's a rule that prohibits it. Yes, then I think, guys, come on.
And there are great examples of legislation that were completely fixated on current solutions. Quite well known, in New York, legislation was created regarding horses in the city, because research showed that this was in the 1900s, 1920, if they looked 20 years into the future, the streets of New York would be covered with 1 to 2 meters of horse manure. It never happened because, of course, other solutions quickly emerged. Ford came with the car. There were even electric cars being produced back then. Only the product market fit was misjudged. It focused on women. Very beautiful things inside. I don't know if you've ever seen them.
I once sat in the first electric car.
Very beautiful interior, place for flowers. Only there was no man who wanted to buy a woman's car. And the man made the decision about which car was bought. And the woman actually preferred that car because the alternatives were less clean, less tidy.
More exhausts. Guests are annoyed by the noise. Electric cars are tidier.
Indeed, Soons, it's quite fascinating to revisit what you just mentioned. What specific issue are you truly addressing? What is the underlying pain? The pain at that time wasn't focused on stopping exhaust emissions. It was far more related to a male ego. This had to be addressed, therefore decisions are made in a specific manner. I still find it utterly absurd what we are currently witnessing. The sheer number of left-wing parties that are now fully committed to policy, which I believe is in stark contrast to their environmental policies over the last 2 decades. However, this is purely motivated by a desire for protection and, yes, other freedoms. Yes, protecting their core freedoms that align with their policies fit. Regardless of any opinion, I find it somewhat hypocritical to then say, we are going to focus fully on defense, conduct military exercises.